Elizabeth's final stepmother once told her, "God has given you great qualities. Cultivate them always and labor to improve them. For I believe that you are destined by heaven to be Queen of England." For the 13-year-old Elizabeth, this prophecy must have been surprising. She had only been restored to the line of succession in 1546, just months before the death of her formidable father, Henry VIII. While the king had approved the restoration of her and her sister Mary's titles, he had never formally reversed their illegitimacy. In any case, her position in the line of succession seemed tenuous. She stood behind her older sister Mary and her younger half-brother, King Edward VI. Any children he had would push her even further down the line. A Chinese proverb reminds us that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Elizabeth was not the only monarch to overcome long odds on the path to the throne, but few faced obstacles as daunting as hers. She was deeply fond of her half-brother and likely had no ill wishes for the 9-year-old boy upon his ascension. The two had been educated together under the guidance of Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife. A secret Lutheran, Catherine ensured that the future king's education emphasized key Protestant principles, ones that would lead him to break from his father's staunch Catholicism, though with himself, rather than the Pope, as the head of church. Religion bound Elizabeth and Edward together. Her mother had been a reformer, and for Elizabeth, embracing Protestantism must have felt like a natural choice. After all, her very birth had been the catalyst for her father's break with the Vatican. She and Edward were together when they received the news of their father's passing. Despite years of mistreatment, Elizabeth wept upon hearing the news. Her little brother later wrote to her, "There is very little need of my consoling you, most dear sister, because from your learning you know what you ought to do, and from your prudence and piety you perform what your learning causes you to know. I perceive you think of our father's death with a calm mind." Edward took the crown in accordance with the wishes of his Privy Council, which governed on his behalf until he came of age. Elizabeth initially went to live with her stepmother, only to find herself entangled in the beginnings of an inappropriate relationship with Catherine's new husband, Thomas Seymour. He had previously proposed marriage to Elizabeth, a fact both had concealed from Catherine. Now, with her residing under his roof, Thomas began to subtly groom her, hoping to use their connection to elevate his own status in Edward's England. Elizabeth was thrown out of the house after the budding relationship was discovered. Abandoned once again, Elizabeth resumed her studies, only to find that Thomas Seymour wasn't done with her. After Catherine's death from childbirth, he renewed his illicit courtship, convinced that third time might be the charm. Behind the scenes, Seymour was probing Elizabeth's finances, laying the groundwork for a rebellion to overthrow his brother, the Lord Protector of England. When the plot was uncovered, Elizabeth was summoned to the court to determine to what degree she was involved in the scheme against her brother's top advisor. Historian Anne Somerset notes, "It is difficult to imagine a more traumatic experience for a 15-year-old girl than to be relentlessly questioned about a compromising episode in her past, in the knowledge that her answers could result in a number of her most trusted associates being tried on a capital charge." Forced to read through depositions detailing her inappropriate encounters with Seymour, the experience was humiliating for Elizabeth. But in the end, it was Seymour who faced the axe. She faced the loss of a potential love interest with remarkable calm, using her limited political capital to try to save the life of the lady of her household, who was being blamed for allowing the affair to progress as far as it had. Next, Elizabeth worked to rehabilitate her public image in the eyes of the young king, carefully cultivating a persona of modesty and reserve. Her brother's health began to decline 4 years into her rebranding project. The disease, likely tuberculosis, proved fatal to the only son of the obsessive Henry VIII. In his final days, Edward made a desperate attempt to prevent the crown from falling into the hands of his Catholic half-sister Mary. Without the approval of Parliament, the dying king altered the line of succession to place Lady Jane Grey, the 15-year-old granddaughter of Henry VII's daughter, as his heir. While we know that Edward, a staunch Protestant, didn't want Mary to succeed him, we can't be sure if he understood the degree to which he was being manipulated by his chief advisor, who likely planned to have Mary arrested upon Edward's death. As one of his final acts, King Edward altered the official line of succession to exclude both of his half-sisters, a move only Parliament had the authority to make. Henry's eldest child, however, was one step ahead. She evaded arrest, rallied a resistance, and ultimately declared herself Queen of England. Her cousin, Jane Grey, was executed after serving as queen for just 9 days. The Smithsonian Magazine quotes historian Sarah Gristwood, who describes Mary's ascension as a staggeringly bold course of action undertaken with little chance of success. After unseating Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, Mary, rode into London to widespread acclaim. In the words of one contemporary chronicler, it was said that no one could ever remember there ever having been a public rejoicing such as this. Indeed, historian Anna Whitelock argues that the scale of Mary's achievement is often overlooked. Mary had just led the only successful revolt against the central government in 16th century England. She had eluded capture, mobilized a counter-coup, and in the moment of crisis, proved courageous, decisive, and politically adept. Unfortunately, those words would rarely be used to describe her actions during her brief reign as Queen of England. Edward's death removed one barrier to Elizabeth's reign, but Mary's actions quickly created a new, insurmountable obstacle. Although Mary had initially been kind to her half-sister, religious tension soon drove a deep wedge between them. Now, Elizabeth found herself as the successor to a queen consumed by anger and vengeance, someone who could not move past the belief that Elizabeth's mother had ruined her life. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assists in the teaching of history. This series is about England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I, episode number 4, In the Court of Bloody Mary. Historian Michael Farquhar notes that Henry VIII was no better a father than he was a husband. Each of the king's children was bruised to some degree by his overwhelming personality, but Mary, his eldest daughter, was absolutely battered by it. For more than 3 decades, the sad princess endured being alternately doted upon, terrorized, and regarded with devastating indifference by her father, until he finally died and left her alone. For decades, Mary had stood defiant against her father, clinging to her Catholic faith. Yet, the constant pressure, combined with her dire circumstances, eventually broke her resolve, and she grudgingly acknowledged her father as supreme head of the church. In doing so, she was compelled to accept the harsh reality that she, too, was a bastard. Once crowned, Mary wasted no time in restoring Catholicism as the official reign of England. Elizabeth, finding no alternative, had little choice but to follow her sister's command. Providing her ability to adapt, Elizabeth promised her sister that she would renounce her Protestant beliefs. It was all a ploy, however, as Somerset details that when Elizabeth attended Mass for the first time, it seemed that the convert was already on the verge of a relapse. Having failed to be excused on the grounds of illness, Elizabeth complained loudly all the way to the church that she had a stomach ache. Queen Mary was much more successful in bending Parliament to her will, convening them in 1553 to dismantle the English Reformation and invalidate her father's divorce from her mother. Mary acted swiftly to resolve an issue her father had long ignored. At 37, she was already considered well past the typical marrying age for a royal princess. She turned her attention to Philip, the future king of Spain and the eldest son of the Holy Roman Emperor. Despite being 10 years younger than her, Philip was the most eligible Catholic on the market. With the support of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, the reconversion of England to Catholicism could move forward immediately. Her deceased half-brother had feared that such an arrangement would come to pass, believing that her marriage to a foreigner would ultimately deprive their family of the crown. At this point in history, the Catholic and the Protestant Christian faiths were pretty well aligned on the fact that proper wives were expected to be totally submissive to their husbands. As the heir, Mary would have struggled to secure such a powerful match, but as Queen of England, she was in a much more advantageous position. She also sought to arrange a marriage for her devout half-sister, only to be frustrated when Elizabeth held firm in her resolve to never wed. This led Mary to pursue a more drastic measure in order to ensure her younger sibling was excluded from the line of succession. Her ultimate hope was to bear Philip's child, but her advanced age and Philip's responsibility outside of England made that outcome far from certain. Historian Thomas Penn writes that politically the match with Philip had a great deal to recommend it. The other European superpower of the 16th century standing in the way of Habsburg domination of the continent was France. Conflict between the Habsburgs and the French flared intermittently. There were 2 main flashpoints: the perpetually war-torn Italian peninsula and the Northwest Europe. Over the years, the struggle between England, France, and the Habsburg Low Country had led to a series of shifting alliances, and both Habsburg and the French agents were active in England, seeking to pull sympathies one way or the other. United with the Habsburgs, England would provide a formidable power base with which to oppose France. Still, she had underestimated the xenophobia that would manifest among her subjects upon the prospect of a Spaniard governing their lives. Partly for this reason, he was excluded from the line of succession. He was to be a consort, somebody who could only exercise sovereignty in conjunction with his wife. He couldn't even employ foreigners in his household, despite the fact that, due to the stifling terms of the marriage treaty, he had to pay his servants out of his own pocket. Mary was plagued by emotions that often led her into dark corners of her mind. Once, she had envied her half-sister, but now suspicion was her dominant feeling. Recognizing the dark clouds on the horizon, Elizabeth requested permission to retreat to the countryside. At this moment, her life, once again, slipped from her control as she was drawn into the schemes of others. A group of powerful English nobles confronted the queen over her intention to marry the King of Spain. When they failed to change her mind, they turned their attention to elevating Elizabeth, a staunch Protestant, to the throne. Although she was associated with several of the conspirators, no evidence suggests that she played an active role in their designs. The plot's leader, after all, sought to marry Elizabeth and seize power, an idea that was undoubtedly not hers. Somerset writes that even if there is no proof that Elizabeth had actually entered into a league with the conspirators, the evidence suggests that she was aware of their intentions. When the rebellion commenced, she made no move to assist it, remaining on her sickbed. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, its embers extinguished before they could spread. In the aftermath, Elizabeth was summoned to London, a call she hesitated to obey. Her reluctance was immediately taken as a sign of guilt, and suspicion deepened when the French ambassador's postbag was found to contain a copy of a letter she had recently sent to the Queen. Issued a fresh summons, she made her way toward London at a painstaking pace, no doubt shuddering as she passed the rebels, decomposing corpses, swaying from hastily erected gallows. For 3 weeks, she remained in isolation as investigators sought to determine her role in what became known as Wyatt's Rebellion. Yet, despite Mary's convictions, the evidence was inconclusive. Even so, Elizabeth was sent to the grim Tower of London, the very place where her mother had met her tragic end. Farquhar sets the scene for us, writing that Elizabeth was taken away by barge in the pouring rain at the entrance to the forbidding structure that had witnessed to centuries of torture, murder, and execution. Elizabeth mustered the dramatic flair that would serve her so well when she became queen herself. She at first refused to leave the barge, but then relented and proclaimed her innocence. With that, she plopped herself down on the steps and refused to budge. With the rain pelting her, she rebuffed pleas to move inside. Huffing, "It is better sitting here than in a worse place." That worst place turned out to be the exact room that her mother had been housed in prior to her grisly execution. It was a form of cruelty that could only be imposed by somebody who intimately knew her, someone who had long nursed a lingering bitterness. Farquhar offers a glimpse into this strained relationship, writing that upon the birth of her half-sister, Mary was given one of the smallest rooms in Elizabeth's household. There was only one princess now, and she was Anne Boleyn's daughter. Whenever the baby traveled in her velvet litter, Mary was forced to walk beside her in the mud. At dinner, Elizabeth was given the chair of honor, while Mary had to sit with the lower ranks. Any servant who showed her the slightest bit of compassion was sent away. Those suspected of encouraging her pretense as a true princess were locked away in the tower. She had to object every time she was called simply Lady Mary or Elizabeth was called Princess. This brought constant punishment upon her. Now, the roles were reversed. Mary was queen, and Elizabeth found herself in a subservient position, far beneath her sister. Journalist Alice Barnes-Browns tells us that Mary was now being advised that her half-sister was too dangerous to live. Her survival looked doubtful, but she was inadvertently rescued from the actions of Thomas Wyatt, the leader of the rebellion. Wyatt had also been committed to the tower and was tortured for information. He denied that he sought Mary's death and that his sole intention was against the coming in of strangers and Spaniards. Crucially, he denied that Elizabeth had been involved in the plot. Having been sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, Wyatt was executed on April 11th. After the execution, many dipped their handkerchiefs in Wyatt's blood, and his head was stolen as a martyr's relic. Wyatt's last words saved Elizabeth from a fate that would have changed history. Although she was still under great suspicion, the government could find no explicit evidence against her. She was moved from the tower to house arrest. And now a word from our sponsors. Historians frequently recount the tale of Elizabeth's written plea, but the harsh reality is, had Mary found the evidence to justify it, she would have ended her sister's story without hesitation. Having been shaped by the pain of her parents' notorious split, Mary lacked the ability to empathize with others. When Elizabeth's heartfelt appeal was placed before her, she responded not with compassion, but with anger, demanding to know which guard had dared to defy her orders. Later, she would extend her strictness even to a child, commanding the yeoman warders to prevent a 5-year-old from handing her flowers on her morning walk. Elizabeth's release, which was met with raucous cheers from the massive crowds, surely frustrated Mary. She was placed under constant guard at one of the Tudor residences, and the isolation led to a brief period of depression. Meanwhile, Mary was celebrating the arrival of Philip in England, marking the beginning of their marriage. The wedding celebration continued for months, but the euphoria of the union quickly gave way to more somber actions. 6 months later, Parliament revived the ancient laws that allowed the church to burn heretics at the stake. While Henry VIII had executed thousands in the name of religious unity, it was his daughter, Mary, who would become known as Bloody Mary for condemning just over 300 to the flames. The deaths were undeniably horrific, but the scale of the executions was modest in comparison to those carried out by other royals. Somerset writes that in an age where cruel punishments were relatively commonplace, the physical suffering of the martyrs cannot wholly account for the sympathy they excited. But many people who would not necessarily have objected to the burning of a few extremists were sickened by the persecution on such an unprecedented scale. The campaign against heresy, which had intended to purify and strengthen the church, fueled the nation's anti-clerical tendencies. Now that he was officially part of the royal family, Philip weighed in on the issue of Elizabeth's fate. He opted to delay her removal from the line of succession, approaching the matter with cold, calculated realpolitik rather than any compassion. Mary, the Queen of Scots, who we'll focus on in our next episode, was the next in line to the throne. Having been raised in the French court, she represented a potential shift that would make England a satellite of Spain's greatest rival. Therefore, Elizabeth served as a stopgap until Philip could provide an heir. Penn points out that there was never any romance between the two, though Mary immediately doted on her dashing husband. Gallant in the public, Philip referred to his older wife as a tia mia, my aunt, in private. Mary, sexually hesitant, increasingly ill, and under great pressure to conceive, would have 2 phantom pregnancies. It was probably at the conclusion of the first, in August 1555, that Philip realized he would never produce an heir. In light of this, Elizabeth's fate, as the likely heir to the throne, was of considerable importance to the Spanish. Facing opposition from the man she loved, Mary reluctantly accepted defeat, bowing to her husband's counsel and permitting Elizabeth to meet with her in person to account for her actions. As she had done in similar situations before, Elizabeth knelt in humble submission, declaring herself a true follower. It did nothing to move the Queen, who stoically told her to rise and head to her apartments. Elizabeth remained confined for a month while the court struggled to make sense of Queen Mary's condition, as she had convinced herself, wrongly, that she was pregnant. Meanwhile, Philip, sidelined from political affairs, had to depart England without having sired an heir. As he left, he encouraged Mary to show more kindness towards Elizabeth, underscoring the critical importance of unity for the nation's stability. It was counsel Mary would soon regret, as another plot began to take form with the aim of replacing the Catholic Tudor with the Protestant. While there is scant evidence of Elizabeth's participation, her status as the plot's intended beneficiary led her facing her sister's fury. Although members of her household were convicted of treason and executed, the Queen refrained from targeting the incredibly popular Elizabeth, feeling too weak to do so without any clear-cut damning evidence. In an effort to keep her enemies close, Mary sent Elizabeth a diamond ring along with an invitation to rejoin her at court. An invitation that was quickly refused. Despite Philip's prolonged absences, he had successfully established a pro-Spanish faction within Mary's court, allowing him to maintain a strong influence. His presence was crucial in preventing Bloody Mary from executing her half-sister more than once. The following year saw yet another rebellion aimed at placing Elizabeth on the throne, a testament to Mary's failure to win the hearts of her subjects. Once again, Philip stepped in to shield his sister-in-law, prioritizing political strategy over his wife's well-being. His chief concern was the possibility of an English-French alliance, which he sought to prevent at all costs. To secure Catholic dominance in England, should Elizabeth ascend the throne, he set out to find her a suitable husband. His solution was to propose an engagement between Elizabeth and his own 11-year-old son from a previous marriage. the infamous Don Carlos, a tragic product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. The young Spaniard would later succumb to violent bouts of insanity, ultimately leading Philip to imprison his own heir. Elizabeth remained resolute in her refusal. Misinterpreting her hesitation as a rejection of the specific groom rather than marriage itself, Mary encouraged her to consider an English noble instead. Yet again, Elizabeth declined, declaring that the affliction she had suffered had ridded her of any wish for a husband. Mary was outraged. This had been an olive branch, a gesture of goodwill toward a subject she could have simply ordered to marry whomever she pleased. Frustrated, but unwilling to force the issue, she begrudgingly conceded, vowing to stay out of her sister's love life. Philip, however, remained insistent, pressing Elizabeth until he was met with an unambiguous response. She would rather die than submit to marriage. Somerset writes that had Philip been able to concentrate exclusively on the marriage issue during his stay in England, he might have browbeaten Mary into compliance, but his principal energies had been devoted to securing another object. After a brief interlude of uneasy peace, France and Spain had gone to war with each other in November 1556, and it had been Philip's desire to bring England into war on Spain's side that had prompted him to visit his wife the following spring. Despite the misgivings of the council, Mary obliged by declaring war in June 1557. But the decision brought her nothing but heartache. Philip rewarded her by leaving the country, never to return. The war itself merely added military defeat to England's already lengthy list of misfortunes. In the aftermath, the Queen was forced to hand over Calais, the last of England's once extensive holdings abroad. The sun appeared to have finally set upon the British Empire. The next year, Mary was plagued by reoccurring bouts of fever, her health deteriorating to a point where all of England understood she was battling a potentially fatal illness. As Penn observes, as the year drew on, a flu epidemic worsened. By the autumn, Mary, sick, childless, depressed, desperate for her husband, and mourning the loss of his father, was in terminal decline. Preoccupied with affairs in France, Philip did not return to his ailing wife's side. Instead, he sent an ambassador with words of comfort, while ever the pragmatist, instructing him to begin cultivating favor with Mary's likely successor, her Protestant half-sister, whom she despised. V.C. Medavy, the president of the Royal Society of Medicine, attempted to fill in the missing parts of the story in 1987. He notes that, in her youth, Mary had bouts of feverish illnesses, digestion and anorexia, sleep disturbance, and depression, due to deprivation of the company of her mother and the mental cruelty by her father. In 1534, Henry sent his favorite physician to see her, reporting that in a mean state of health, she is diseased in her head and stomach. Upon her death, physicians attributed Mary's demise to influenza, an illness she herself had called her old guest. Others speculated that the crushing disappointment of yet another phantom pregnancy had hastened her decline. However, taking all her symptoms into account, Medivh concluded that the queen likely suffered from a tumor at the base of her brain. The doctor concludes his analysis by emphasizing that Mary Tudor's case is significant beyond its medical implications. He reflects, had she lived today, a diagnosis could have been made and various methods of treatment would have been available. If Queen Mary had received successful treatment, the history of England, of Europe, and of the whole Western world might well have been very different. The vision of a united Europe, perhaps linked with North and South America, might have come into existence in the 16th or 17th centuries. Instead, fate took a different course, delivering England into the hands of Queen Elizabeth I. Upon receiving word of her half-sister's death, Elizabeth is said to have fallen to her knees, exclaiming with joy, "This is the doing of the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." As Elizabeth journeyed through the English countryside to claim her crown, she was met with crowds of jubilant subjects eager to celebrate their new queen. Observing the shift in power, a Spanish ambassador was asked how she would govern. His reply was telling. Everything depends upon the husband this woman takes. Philip, the late queen's widower, wasted no time in proposing marriage to England's new ruler. She did not bother to respond. Her silence spoke volumes. She had no intention of placing herself under any man's authority, and soon she would prove it to the world, declaring with resolute confidence that she would rule as her father had. Although Mary Tudor's role in Elizabeth's story ends here, it is worth pausing to consider how history remembers her. The Smithsonian Magazine observes that the Tudor Queen is remembered as one of the most reviled figures in English history, Bloody Mary. Yet hers is a story of how a heroic underdog became a monarch who was then mythologized as a violent despot, despite being no bloodier than her father or many other English monarchs. It's a tale of sexism, shifting national identity, and good old-fashioned propaganda, all of which coalesced to create the image of an unchecked tyrant that endures today. Whitelock points out that Mary's ascension had changed the rules of the game, and the nature of this new, feminized politics was yet to be defined. Yet in many respects, Mary proved more than equal to the task. Decisions over the details of the practice and the power of a queen regent became precedents for the future. In 1554, Mary's Parliament passed the Act for Regal Power, which enshrined in law that queens held power as fully, wholly, and absolutely as their male predecessors, thereby establishing the gender-free authority of the crown. Mary's return to Catholicism was, in many ways, a course correction that aligned with the country's historical roots. However, much like her brother Edward had done by advancing Protestantism too quickly, Mary also faced backlash for her hard reset. Historian Alison Weir suggests that the Queen's reforms were initially viewed as sensible, even measured, yet as her actions became increasingly linked to her Spanish husband Philip, the situation took a turn. Although he was forced to rule alongside his queen, Philip's influence loomed large as he brought with him a version of the Spanish Inquisition to England. Mary relied heavily on his spiritual advisor, who became the primary figure offering counsel on matters of heresy. Gristwood highlights that during this time, it was widely accepted that heretics who refused to recant were deserving of death, a belief that was nearly universal. Inaction was simply not seen as an option. Doing nothing wasn't an option, as historian Linda Porter notes that in the mid-16th century, the idea of respecting another person's beliefs would have provoked disbelief. Such certainties bred oppressors and those who were willing to be sacrificed. Mary, hoping that a few public burnings would bring back the country to its Catholic roots, underestimated the resolve of her Protestant subjects, who were willing to die for their faith. Whenever Mary voiced concerns about the suffering her policies caused, her Spanish advisors urged her to stay the course. Doing so led historian Miranda Twist to place Bloody Mary on her list of the most evil men and women in history, ranking her alongside figures like Hitler, Vlad the Impaler, Ivan the Terrible, and Pol Pot. Her 16th century contemporaries began defining her rule with Bartholomew Tron, claiming that the queen swimmeth in the holy blood of the most innocent, virtuous, and excellent personages. While 300 innocent sent to the stake certainly constitutes as a massacre, Mary remains the only one in her family to bear the charged title, Bloody. Henry VIII, during his 38 years in power, burned 81 people at the stake, but his reign resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 57,000 to 72,000 people. Many of these victims were hanged, while others were quartered, beheaded, disemboweled, and some even boiled alive. Young Edward's suppression of the Prayer Book Rebellion led to the deaths of approximately 5,500 Catholics. As you will see in future episodes, Elizabeth is often praised for finding a balance that allowed religious freedom within her kingdom, dramatically shifting away from her half-sister's more intolerant rule. However, Elizabeth, too, had her own share of blood on her hands, overseeing the execution of 800 Catholic rebels, sentencing at least 183 Catholics to the extra pain of being hanged, drawn, and quartered for treason. It was John Foxe who most contributed to the enduring image of Bloody Mary. His 1563 publication, Foxe's Book of Martyrs, portrayed the gruesome tales of Mary's reign, mixing eyewitness accounts with dramatic woodcut illustrations. This controversial book, unsuitable for children, was shockingly placed alongside the Bible in churches. Meanwhile, Mary's more practical contributions, like restructuring the economy, organizing the militia, and rebuilding the navy, were largely disregarded. Though these efforts would later benefit Elizabeth, the credit was never given to her predecessor. Instead, generations of school children continued to learn that England's first female monarch was Bloody Mary. This is yet again another example of how the pages of history often conceal inconvenient truths, reinforcing the patriarchal narrative and minimizing the legacy of women in power. Elizabeth managed to avoid the same fate as her sister Mary, despite Porter's observation that Mary burned Protestants and Elizabeth disemboweled Catholics. It's not pretty either way. Her escape from similar judgment can largely be attributed to 3 key factors. First, by refusing to marry, Elizabeth sidestepped the xenophobia that had fueled Mary's religious violence, preventing a similarly violent narrative from developing around her reign. Second, Elizabeth ruled long enough to distribute her actions across her lengthy rule, allowing her accomplishments to overshadow her darker decisions. As the saying goes, the winners write the story, and Elizabeth, one of history's most renowned monarchs, had a hand in crafting her legacy. Finally, Elizabeth controlled the propaganda machine, something her Catholic counterparts struggled with. Anyone familiar with our series on the Spanish Inquisition knows that Europe's Protestants excelled at utilizing the printing press to promote their beliefs. Elizabeth, as a champion of Protestantism, understood that maintaining a positive image was inseparable from the broader reputation of the Protestant movement that had emerged from Luther's Reformation. As this series progresses, I'll make sure to present an accurate portrayal of Elizabeth's reign, which, like all monarchs, includes its share of violent missteps. I encourage you, as you continue your own education, to approach historical figures with a discerning eye. No one is purely good or entirely evil. This is true of Bloody Mary as well. In fact, a recent viral ad campaign highlighted just how easily history can be twisted. A digital ad in a London subway station initially depicted a serene Queen Mary, only to morph into a grotesque, zombie-like version of herself, with sunken eyes, pale skin, and an open mouth and scarred face. The London Dungeon was immediately asked to remove the ad due to the distress it caused children. However, the company remained defiant, insisting that it would run the ad during school holidays. They defended their decision, claiming it meant to highlight the dark side of Queen Mary's character and portray her as a villain. The spokesperson concluded, "It's obviously historical and in no way irresponsible. In the end, history, like any story, is often shaped by those who tell it. And in the case of Queen Mary, the narrative continues to be colored by the shadows of the past." I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting Empires Pod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.